Tonight, we're traveling far back into the dry, golden dust of ancient Egypt, into a palace where the walls held secrets, and the bloodlines ran like the Nile itself, slow, sacred, and inescapably intertwined. You were born into the house of life. Not a royal child, not quite, but close. Close enough to feel the heat of the throne every time you breathed. Your mother's hands smelled of blue lotus and myrrh. Your father's sandals whispered along stone floors. He was a priest in the temple of Hathor, keeper of music, fertility, and the divine order that pharaohs ruled beneath. Your family didn't just serve power, they touched it. From the age of 5, you were watched, not for your voice, but for your silence, not for your playfulness, but for the way you held your eyes when older women passed. You were graceful. That mattered more than anything, because one day, someone would choose you, and not for love. They called it noble blood, the thing you carried in your veins that marked you as sacred, not special, not free. Sacred, you knew what it meant when your older cousin disappeared. One day she was dancing barefoot under the shade of fig trees. The next, her anklets were left behind, and her name was spoken only in soft tones. You asked your mother, and she didn't answer. She just kissed your forehead and pressed a scarab amulet into your palm. The first time you saw the pharaoh, you were 7. He sat beneath a canopy woven with gold and lapis thread, motionless as a statue. The air shimmered with heat around him. He wore no crown, no cobra, just linen robes and rings heavy with meaning. Beside him stood a woman veiled in sheer white. You thought she was a goddess, but your tutor leaned in and whispered, "That's the queen, his sister." You blinked. You must have misunderstood, but no, there it was again, quieter this time. His blood is hers, her blood is his. That is how we keep the gods close. You didn't ask anything else, you simply watched. The way she never turned her face, fully. The way everyone bowed deeper for her than anyone else in the court, even the priests. Years passed like the slow curve of the Nile. You grew tall, your eyes darkened. At 11, they began wrapping your robes tighter across your chest. At 12, your hair was oiled and combed every morning by women who did not look you in the eye. You were being shaped. One morning, your mother summoned you before dawn. She smoothed your dress, lined your eyes with kohl. Her hands trembled slightly. You thought she was nervous for a ceremony, but there was no ceremony. Just a single man waiting across the temple courtyard. The pharaoh's steward. He looked you over, like someone checking for cracks in a jar, then nodded once. That night, you weren't allowed to sleep in your own room. You were moved into the women's quarters of the royal palace. No explanation, no smile, no farewell. Your mother stood at the threshold and placed her hand on your cheek. "You belong to the line now," she whispered. That was all. They gave you a new name. They always do. Not a different one, just a refined one, polished like ivory, shortened like a prayer. They said it would suit your role better. You didn't yet know what that role was. But every time the queen walked past your chamber and didn't look at you, you felt it tightening around your throat, because she saw you. Of course she did. She had once been you. The queen did not speak to you. She passed by your doorway each morning like a breeze you weren't allowed to feel. She never glanced inside, but the soft beat of her sandals, the subtle clink of her bracelets, and the way all the servants froze at her approach that told you everything. She knew you were there, and she was waiting. Your days began early, always in silence. You would wake to find a folded robe placed at the foot of your bed. linen freshly pressed, no adornment. A young girl, barely older than 10, would fill your clay basin and leave before you turned. There was no ceremony to your new life, just ritual. After washing and dressing, you walked alone to the east chamber. There, beneath high-arched ceilings, painted with falcons and stars, the priestess Kemet awaited you. She did not greet you. She never smiled, but her voice was warm, calm, in a way that let you know she had once been someone like you, once. Today, you will study the customs of the House of the Two Lands, she said. You nodded. She opened a scroll and read aloud, A royal daughter does not laugh in the court. A royal sister does not drink without invitation. A bride of divine blood must step with the sun at her left shoulder, never the right. These weren't just traditions, they were rules to live by, or rules to survive by. Kemet taught you what flowers were permitted in your hair, lotus in spring, papyrus in the flood season. She showed you how to receive a compliment without appearing proud, and how to enter a room where your brother husband already stood, eyes low, hands soft, chin lifted just enough to show honor. Not arrogance. This was not seduction. This was sacred. Performance. At night, your chamber remained cold. The palace walls were thick, made to trap heat in winter and cast it off in summer. But you still lay awake, the thin linen covering doing nothing to stop the stillness from wrapping around your ribs. Some nights, you imagined escaping. Not far, just to the old temple gardens, where wild reeds grew along the river and frogs hummed in the dusk. You remembered how your cousin once whispered that girls who climbed temple walls were turned into ibises, cursed to watch the palace forever, never touching the ground again. You wondered if that might be better than becoming what you were now, becoming. Weeks passed, you did not speak to the pharaoh, but the queen continued to walk by. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. It was the festival of Opet, a time when statues of Ammon and Mut were floated down the Nile on ceremonial barges, surrounded by dancers, drummers, and cheering crowds. But not you. You were not allowed to join the crowd. You were summoned to the inner chamber of the queen's private temple. There, beneath the soft glow of lamp oil and the perfume of pressed rose petals, the queen finally spoke your name. She said it as though trying it on for size, like someone weighing a ring. She stood beside a stone basin and dipped her fingers into its dark water. You're young, she said. You think this is a game of love and fate, but it's not. She turned. It's a game of inheritance, a game played with names and wombs. You stood motionless, she continued. My brother loves what he believes is divine. He does not love women. He loves symbols. He loves power. Then, for the first time, she smiled. But it was not kind. He will love you because you are me. You opened your mouth, maybe to speak, maybe just to breathe. But she raised a hand. I will not stop him, she said. I will not protect you, but I will not hate you either. Then she left. You remained alone, standing in a room where oil lamps flickered and sacred water clung to the sides of the basin like tears. That night, you were given a necklace, lapis, with a single carved scar, a bee. No one told you what it meant, but the next morning, the servants bowed slightly lower than usual, and your food arrived on a silver dish instead of clay. The day after, you were instructed to move chambers. Not far, just a floor higher. But the air was different there. It smelled of almond oil and cedar, and the silence, it was heavier. You had entered the chamber of the waiting wives. The other girls didn't speak to you. One was older, her face blank as papyrus. Another sat cross-legged each morning, humming to herself and weaving invisible patterns in the air. A third barely left her bed. They weren't prisoners, but they weren't free. They had all been brought here, like you, not for love, for blood. For potential, each one of them was a cousin, a niece, a half-sister, a piece of a dynasty held together by names and oaths and gods carved in gold. They were brides waiting to be summoned, and you had just become one of them. On the third evening in your new room, you heard footsteps pause outside your door. Then a knock, a single, flat knock. You opened it to find a young boy, no more than 9, holding a scroll. He offered it. Without a word, you opened it slowly. Inside, one line in immaculate ink: the sun chooses its own reflection. There was no seal, no name, but you knew you had been summoned, not by command, but by recognition. Flowing in the same immersive tone, you did not sleep that night. You sat by the narrow slit of a window in your new chamber, watching the moon drift between the carved papyrus columns outside. The letter, the one with no seal, lay beside your pillow. You had read it once, but its meaning pressed against your skin like heat. The sun chooses its own reflection. Not a summons, not a threat, but something final. Like the moment a flood rises just enough to cover the mark carved on a wall. When the oil in your lamp finally burned out, you didn't refill it. You simply sat in the dark, watching the outline of your hands folded in your lap, waiting for what you already knew would come. And it did. Just before dawn, footsteps padded down the corridor. You recognized them not by sound, but by rhythm. Slower than a servant, firmer than a priestess. Someone used to others stepping aside. You stood before the knock came. The same boy as before, scroll in hand. But this time, he said something. Now. He whispered. You didn't speak. You didn't ask where. You followed. The palace was quiet at that hour, not silent. Quiet like breath held, not exhaled. The boy led you past halls where carved gods watched from stone, through a passage you had never entered. It narrowed, then opened suddenly into a round chamber lit by a single hanging brazier. He was there, the Pharaoh. He stood in the center of the chamber, facing a wall where hieroglyphs gleamed faintly in the flickering light. He did not turn when you entered. The boy left without a sound. The door closed behind you. You stood, eyes lowered, hands clasped, like you had been taught. Still, the silence stretched long enough for doubt to creep in. Perhaps this wasn't what you thought. Perhaps you were only here for ritual, for offering, for a test. Then he spoke. I watched you dance once, he said. His voice was not like the others. It did not echo. It didn't need to. In the temple of Hathor, you were a child. You said nothing. Not because you were afraid, but because you weren't sure if the memory was yours. You moved as if you belonged to the earth, he continued. But your eyes belonged to the stars. You blinked slowly. That too was something you'd been taught. Move your gaze gently. Let silence speak. He turned then. His eyes, painted in coal, rested on you, not with hunger, not even curiosity, with certainty. You have my blood, he said. You nodded, double quotes, do you accept it? There it was. The question not written in scrolls, not chanted in temple hymns, not do you love me, not will you marry me, only do you accept what you already are? You nodded again. He stepped toward you, slowly. As he reached you, he lifted a hand not to touch your face or your shoulder, but to rest his fingers against the pendant at your throat. Lapis, Scarab. The mark of selection. This isn't about you, he said, voice low, then softer. It never is. You did not return to your chamber. They brought you instead to the Queen's wing. She was not there. You passed rooms thick with incense and curtains drawn low. You were shown a bed carved of ebony, sheets dyed with indigo, bowls of fruit arranged in perfect symmetry, everything prepared. Your new space was not larger, but it was deeper. The ceilings vaulted, the walls painted with stars, the silence shaped the night. You were bathed in pomegranate oil. Your nails were stained with henna. Gold thread was braided into your hair, though no one told you who would see it. They left you alone, but the room still felt watched. The days that followed bled into one another. There was no announcement, no ceremony, but word traveled. The palace shifted. Servants moved differently. Eyes lowered deeper. Your food changed, fresher, spiced with saffron and sweet fig. You were summoned often now, sometimes to sit by the Pharaoh's side during minor rituals, sometimes to walk beside him as he inspected offerings, sometimes only to kneel as he read from scrolls in silence. You were not his queen, you were his blood, and blood in Egypt was law. The queen returned after 10 days. You saw her across the courtyard, walking slowly, alone. She wore white, unadorned, her feet bare. She passed you without speaking, without even looking. But later that night, there was a tap at your chamber. Not a knock, a tap. Like a moth brushing wood, you opened the door to find her already. Walking away, she didn't speak until you followed her through 2 corridors and a garden. Then, in the open air beneath the moon, she turned. "Do you dream?" she asked. You hesitated, sometimes and times. "What do you see?" You thought carefully. "Rivers, fire, my mother's hands." She studied you. "I dreamed of you," she said. You didn't answer. "In my dream, you were me." But you did not break. You looked at her, then really looked. She was not old, but her face had the quiet cracks of someone who had learned to speak in ways no voice could carry. She nodded to herself. "Keep your dreams close," she said. "They are the only things no one will take from you." Then she walked away. You returned to your room, unsure if you had been warned or blessed. One evening, a priestess brought you a small wooden box. Inside, a comb of ivory, a ring carved with the symbol of rebirth, and a folded piece of linen. When you unfolded it, you saw what was drawn in gold thread to falcons, facing each other, a twin image, sister and brother, your new emblem. There would be no formal declaration, no stone carving, no decree read aloud. Just this, a symbol, placed silently into the world, where everyone would understand what it meant, that you had become his reflection, that you were now his mirror. That night, you returned to the old balcony, where you once watched the queen pass below. Now, she stood inside, watching you, and you understood she had not been watching you out of jealousy, but grief. She had known you would come, because there was no other way. There was no crown, no festival, no crowds cheering your name from below the palace balconies. There was only the emblem, the falcons, facing each other. From that day forward, you were no longer referred to by name alone. You were she who mirrors the throne, not wife, not queen, not consort, something stranger, deeper. You became a symbol that moved through rooms and rituals, silent, expected, inevitable. And yet, in the quiet corners of the palace, you were still just yourself. In the mornings, you still braided your own hair. You still tied the linen across your chest with hands that trembled sometimes. You still awoke wondering if your mother remembered the warmth of your sleeping breath against her shoulder. But that was not the girl they saw anymore. That girl had been hidden beneath protocol and paint. That girl had been traded for power. It began with appearances. You sat beside the Pharaoh during evening offerings, not on the throne beside him, but just behind and to the left. Your seat was carved with papyrus stalks and sacred beetles, a signal that you were fertile, guarded, aligned with both resurrection and birth. He did not speak to you during ceremony. He did not need to. He only glanced, just once, and the court. Read it like scripture. Priests bowed lower. Servants stilled their hands when pouring wine. Even the older scribes, with their ink-stained fingers and hollowed cheeks, looked at you now with a blend of reverence and caution, because they knew what the queen had once been, and they knew what you were now becoming. In the 7th month of your presence in the inner court, you were assigned an assistant. Her name was Iset. She was young, perhaps 14, but moved with the calm of someone much older. She spoke only when needed, but when she did, it was with the precision of a woman who had listened more than she had lived. Iset carried scrolls, arranged flowers, replenished your oils, but never asked questions until one night you were seated beside the fountain in the northern courtyard. The sky above was velvet dark, and the air had cooled just enough for the lamps to flicker. You held a piece of papyrus in your hands, blank, save for a single drawn line in charcoal. You had no words that night, only shapes, only feeling. Iset approached, her arms folded neatly. "Do you miss it?" she asked. You looked up, surprised by the break in rhythm. "Miss what?" "The world before the silence," she said. "Before the paint, before the robes." You said nothing for a long while. Then, yes, she nodded, as if she'd known the answer, but needed to hear it aloud to mourn it properly. "I think the queen does too," she added. You looked toward the palace windows. Somewhere behind one of them, she was likely watching, maybe remembering, maybe waiting for you to understand what she already had. The queen summoned you 3 days later, not to scold, not to advise to speak. She was seated on the wide balcony overlooking the gardens. A low table beside her held a bowl of grapes and a jug of wine. She was not veiled. You realized then that she'd removed the veil only 3 times in your presence. Once when you arrived, once when you were chosen, and now you are with child, she said. There was no question in it, just a fact, a ripple across still water. You swallowed. Yes, she picked a grape, turned it in her fingers, but didn't eat it. "The court is not yet ready," she said, "but the gods are." You stared at the sky, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. "What happens now?" you asked. She looked at you then, fully. "What always happens," she said. "You disappear. You are not exiled. You were moved to a palace far upriver, near the place where the crocodile god Sobek was still worshipped in smaller temples. The air was thicker there, richer with green. The Nile curved near the edge of the palace walls like a protective arm. Your new chambers were large, but nearly empty. The ceilings were painted with lotus and vultures, and there were no guards posted. At the door, only Iset remained. She came without being asked, her satchel light, her voice quieter than before. "Will I return?" You asked her once, weeks into the silence. She didn't answer for a long time. Then, you never really left. Time and exile passed in different measure. The priest said, The pharaoh did not want your pregnancy scrutinized by the court. They feared omens. They feared gossip. They feared the echoes of what had come before. But you knew the truth. It wasn't fear of your child. It was fear of power without order. Because if a child could be born outside the palace walls, yet still carry the full blood of the throne, what else could be done outside of sight? What else could be imagined? You kept track of time by the sound of birds. They sang louder at the edges of the season, quieter in the high heat. You marked your days with clay beads, one for each sunrise. By the time the basket overflowed, you had grown heavy. You walked slowly through the courtyard. Your balance altered. Sometimes you whispered to the unborn child, not prayers, not names, just fragments of your own memory. You spoke of the time your mother showed you how to wash a clay cup without leaving streaks, of the smell of rain on hot stone, of your cousin's laughter beneath the fig trees. You wanted the child to know there had been softness. Once, before duty, before mirrors, the birth came at night. No scream, no procession, no priests, just you. Is it? And one old midwife, with hands like folded linen. It was not easy, but it was clean. A boy, born with wide eyes and silence. You held him against your chest, and did not speak for hours. He did not cry. He simply breathed. The midwife wept quietly. Is smiled for the first time in months. You did not name him. You weren't allowed. Not yet. By sunrise, a barge had arrived at the palace. Not gilded, not guarded. Just one man, dressed in robes of clay red and carrying a scroll. He read from it without emotion. The child shall be delivered to the temple of Ammon, raised as sacred, and returned when the gods command. You did not weep. You kissed the boy's forehead. You wrapped him in linen. You placed the scarab necklace at his chest, and then you let him go. The boat disappeared into the morning mist, a pale blur on the Nile. You stood at the edge of the dock, hands still damp from swaddling linen, chest hollow. The barge turned a bend in the river and was gone. No drumbeat, no chant, just silence. That was how your son left you, without a name, without a cry, without even a backward glance. They would say he was chosen. You knew he was taken. The days after felt longer than pregnancy itself. It moved through the palace like a ghost. She still brought food, drew the bath, pressed cold cloth to your head when the fever came. But neither of you said much. The air had changed. You were not grieving a death. You were grieving a tradition. You'd thought, perhaps foolishly, that birth would bring something real, a bond, a recognition, a reason to remain. Instead, it had revealed what was always true. You were not mother. You were vessel. Messages came. Short, stiff scrolls from the capital, signed only with sacred symbols. The child thrives. He receives instruction. He bears the mark. Not a single word about you. Nothing about your health, your sleep, your dreams. You could have vanished from the earth and the Nile would carry on, but you hadn't vanished. You were still there, watching the crocodiles sunbathe near the reeds, still tracing cracks in the floor tiles at dawn, still remembering. One morning, you woke before the birds. The palace was shadowed, its walls breathing in the chill before sunrise. You stepped out into the garden barefoot, pressing your soles into the damp earth. It had rained during the night. The scent of wet clay reminded you of your childhood, of running through temple courtyards, of dropping water jars and blaming the cat, of hiding under the offering tables when the priests rehearsed their hymns. You were not a mother then. You were not a wife. You were just a girl who belonged to herself. Now, you belonged to a story too large to see all at once. That same morning, Izzet brought news. The pharaoh had taken a new sister wife, younger, from a different branch of the bloodline. The queen remained silent and present, but her eyes no longer rested on you when your name was spoken. If it was spoken at all, the child had made you sacred, but also finished. They had what they needed. You were complete, and therefore no longer central. You nodded when Izzet told you, not out of surprise, but confirmation. A piece had moved on the board, so you adjusted your posture and stayed where you were. In the 6th month of your exile, an old man arrived at the palace. He did not bow, he carried no seal, but the guards let him pass. You met him in the shaded colonnade where orange trees grew. He introduced himself as Korif, a former priest, a reader of dreams, once an advisor to your grandfather. Though you had no memory of him, he offered no prophecy. He only asked one question: do you wish to remain? It took you a full minute to answer. No, you said softly, then more firmly, but I will. He nodded. That is how empires are built. Korif did not live in the palace. He had a hut beyond the far gate, near the riverbank where fishermen cast nets into the reeds. But he returned each week to sit with you, sometimes in silence, sometimes to speak of forgotten kings, sometimes to ask about your dreams. You did not tell him the real ones, only the safe ones. But even those revealed too much. You began to write again, not on scrolls that would be seen. You etched words into shards of broken pottery, then buried them among the roots of the olive tree by the bathhouse. You wrote in layers, memory under metaphor, truth under prayer. The mirror has cracked, but its reflection still shines. The blood that binds is the same that silences. They cannot take what you do not name. It helped, somehow too. Leave part of yourself behind, even if it was underground. By the time the rains came again, you were stronger, not healed, not restored, but more solid. You walked the gardens at sunrise. You recited the old hymns, not for the gods, but to hear your own voice. You braided Iset's hair when her hands trembled from illness. You helped the cooks prepare lentils. You grew herbs on the window ledge, and when the scroll arrived, you didn't tremble. It was sealed in gold. A single line, return, you said. Goodbye to the river in the quiet way it taught you, by standing still and listening until the sound of water became your breath. Then you boarded the barge. This time, you were alone. No midwives, no priestesses. Just you and Izzet, who never asked if you were ready, because she knew no one ever is. The capital had changed. The palace was larger. Its walls expanded, its halls filled with new faces, new wives, new guards, new paintings along the corridors. You recognized almost nothing, except her, the queen. She stood on the upper balcony, watching your return. She had not aged, or if she had, the lines on her face had simply grown deeper into the stone of her expression. When you bowed, she did not respond, but she did not look away. They placed you in a chamber overlooking the courtyard, not high, not low, a middle place, a quiet place. You asked no questions. You unpacked your robe. You brushed your hair. You placed the scarab on the table and lit a single lamp. No one came that night, no summons, no scroll, just a single tray of food and a clean linen for your bed. You lay down in silence, And for the first time in many weeks, you slept deeply, not because you were safe, but because the uncertainty had ended. You were back in the house of power, and everything from this point forward would move like the river, steady, slow, and entirely out of your control. It was not the same palace, and yet it was. The walls had been painted anew, the columns carved deeper. The air felt denser, as though the very stones had absorbed more secrets, more whispers, more unspoken grief. But beneath the fresh colors, beneath the polished floors and the gold-laced drapery, the shape of things remained. Rooms still led into other rooms. Corridors still curved to conceal footsteps. The center still held its silence like a lung too, long without breath. And you were not new here. You had simply been reinserted into the script. The queen received you without ceremony. You found her on the terrace overlooking the garden basin, where blue lotuses floated like coins tossed into a wishing pool. She was seated on a low stool, braiding her own hair. When she looked up, her expression revealed nothing. "I see the river returned you," she said. You bowed. It did. Was it gentle? No more or less than expected. She returned to her braid. "You've grown leaner," she said. You touched your wrist. I shed what wasn't mine. For a moment, you both said nothing. Then she spoke without looking up. "They brought me a painting of your son." You froze. "He's tall," she continued. "He holds the stylus as if it were a weapon." You breathed in slowly. "Does he know who I am?" Her fingers paused in her hair. "He knows who he was born from," she said, "but not yet what that means." Then, finally, she met your eyes. "He is safe, and for now, that is enough." You were not invited back to the ceremonies. Not yet. You were given a different role. They called it Advisor of the Inner Harmony, a name that meant everything and nothing. You did not speak in court, but you attended. You sat at the margins, listening, watching, reading movements like others read glyphs. A flick of the pharaoh's hand, the tension in a general's jaw, the tremble in a eunuch's cup. You were not a ghost. You were a mirror, one they no longer dared gaze into, yet could not fully turn away from. It remained by your side. She had aged, but her steps were still measured. Her hands still steady when she set out your robes in the morning. But her voice had softened, grown round with memory. "Do you regret returning?" she asked one evening as she lit the oil lamp. "No," you said, "but I remember the garden by the river." She smiled. "You never buried your roots there. But something grew anyway. You kept to yourself. There were other women now, younger, hungrier. They spoke in fast whispers behind silk screens, their laughter high and brittle. They watched you from the corners of their eyes, but none approached. You weren't competition. You were precedent, a story they might become or avoid. You offered no warnings, no smiles. They would learn, as you had, that a smile in the palace was not a gesture of kindness. It was a wager. Then came the invitation, a scroll delivered by the hand of a priestess, sealed with the pharaoh's mark. You opened it in silence. The boy enters his first rite of balance. Join us. It was not a request. And yet, something in your chest ached as if it were a favor you never thought to be granted. The ceremony took place in the temple of Ammon, the same one where you had once stood as a girl, watching the queen pass with a gaze like a blade. Now you were the one being watched. The crowd was smaller than you expected. Only high priests, a handful of nobles, and you. Your son stood at the center. surrounded by incense and shadow. He was taller than you remembered. His face carried a familiarity that stole your breath, the jawline of your father, the eyes of your cousin, but the posture that was yours. The pharaoh entered last, flanked by guards and silence. He did not look at you. He only stepped forward, placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, and began the prayer. You listened not to the words, but to the pauses between them. You could hear the weight of lineage, the caution, the expectation. When the rite ended, the crowd parted, and your son was taken into the sanctum for private instruction. You turned to leave, but a voice stopped you. He asked about you. You turned, the queen. She stood in shadow, her hands clasped. He asked why he does not know your voice. Your throat tightened. What did you tell him? That you are the echo he will recognize when he is ready. You didn't ask for more. There was nothing more to ask. The next few months passed like smoke through the corridors, visible only in certain light. You resumed your position in the inner circle. You sat near the court scribes. During festivals, offered interpretations of omens and blessed herbs used for childbirth. Among the palace women, your name returned to the scrolls, but not your title. You were never again called wife or sister, only mirror. You thought you might hate it, but over time you came to understand what it meant. A mirror does not lie, but it does not speak unless spoken to. One night, you received a second invitation. This time, it came in the form of silence. A guard knocked once. No scroll, no explanation. You followed. The path led not to the throne room, not to the temple, but to the private library. You hadn't stepped inside it since your training days. The walls were taller than memory. The air thick with the scent of ink and cedar. At the center, seated at a low table, was the pharaoh. Older now, not frail, but stiller. His robes were plain, his crown removed. He looked up, nodded once. Sit, you did. He poured 2 cups of wine. I saw the boy speak to the high priest today, he said. You waited. He held himself like a ruler. You looked into your cup. He was born of the line, and of a woman stronger than most men I've ever known. You met his eyes. I did. Not come for praise. He sipped his wine, no. You came for your reflection. He stood, walked toward the scroll wall, pulled one down. Laid it before you. Your son's name. Written in gold, he touched the script. He will rule, and when he does, they will say he carried both sun and shadow in his blood. Then he looked at you. You were the shadow. You stood. No. I was the light they hid in the dark. He smiled, faint, tired. Yes, that. The conversation with the pharaoh echoed long after you left the library. You returned to your chamber quietly, stepping past the curtained doorways and oil-lit corridors without being seen. Is it weighted with your evening tea? But one look at your face, and she said nothing. You sat by the window for hours, fingers curled around the ceramic cup, the wine from the library still warm in your blood. You were the light they hid in the dark. You had heard many things said about you over the years, names spoken with reverence, disdain, calculation. But this was something different, something heavier than flattery and deeper than regret. It sounded like a truth whispered to. Late, you began waking earlier, before the temple bells, before the servants' footsteps. You would sit in the eastern garden, just as the sun peeled over the edge of the river. The sky always began in silence, and then the birds, always the birds. Is it joined you one morning, her shawl pulled tightly over her head. "He dreams of you," she said after a long pause. You turned toward her. "Who told you?" "I hear things. The guards near his wing speak of a woman in white, standing near his bed while he sleeps." You said nothing. Perhaps the gods allow him your memory in fragments. You closed your eyes. Or perhaps memory is stronger than permission. You saw your son again on the 10th festival of rebirth. He stood beside the high priest, his arms crossed in ritual form, his chest bare and painted in gold. He looked taller, stronger, no longer a boy, but not quite a man. His eyes, though they hadn't changed. When the procession ended and the offerings were burned, you turned to leave. But as you stepped away, something stopped you. A whisper, soft, direct, "Mother." You froze, turned. He stood there, at the temple gate. Alone, no guards, no priest, no ceremony. You didn't move, you didn't speak. He approached slowly. "I knew your face," he said. "Before I knew your name." You felt the breath catch in your throat. "How?" you whispered. "In dreams," he said. "In mirrors." You reached out, hesitant, but his hand was already there. For a moment, you simply held each other's gaze, and in that space, something long buried rose to the surface. Recognition. He stepped closer. "Why did you leave?" Your voice trembled, but you kept it steady. "I was never meant to stay." The queen summoned you the next day. She did not sit on her throne. She stood by the open window, a scroll in her hand. "I heard he spoke to you." You nodded. He remembered. She turned slowly. "I did not think he would ask so soon. He has questions." "He always did," she said. You studied her face. "You're afraid." "No," she said. "I'm preparing." "For what?" She rolled the scroll tightly and set it down. "For being replaced." After that, things moved quickly. Your son was granted his own wing in the palace. He was given scribes, military instructors, and astronomers. His name was spoken more often. His steps were followed more closely. You watched from a distance, neither hidden nor announced. Sometimes he would glance across the court, just long enough to find you in the shadows. He never waved, never smiled, but you both understood. There was power in silence. There always had been. One afternoon, you visited the temple library. You hadn't returned since your time in exile. You moved slowly between the tall shelves, running, your fingers along the edges of scrolls, some so old they flaked at the corners. A boy followed behind you, not your son, but another acolyte, perhaps 12 years old. He paused at one scroll. "This one was read to the prince," he said. You took it, unrolling it gently. A story of divine union, the marriage of Isis and Osiris, a tale older than the walls around you. You read it in silence. When you finished, you rolled it back and handed it to the boy. "Remember," you said, "not all sacred things are kind." Later that week, the queen invited you to her private garden. She sat beneath the fig tree, her robe loosed around her shoulders. "I've started dreaming again," she said. You sat beside her. "What do you see?" "A girl," she said. "Not you, not me. Someone new. Your replacement." "His," she said. You looked at her. "He's still a boy." "No," she said. "He isn't." She turned to you. "He will not forget you." "You should. Be careful." You raised an eyebrow. "You fear I'll turn him." She gave a small smile. "I fear he already sees what you are." You said nothing, because you didn't need to. That night, he came to your chamber. Not in secret, he walked through the hall like a man who owned it. The guard stepped aside. Izzard opened the door and then vanished like a shadow on wind. He stood in your doorway, taller now than even the Pharaoh had been in your memory. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. You stepped aside. He entered. "Did you ever want to rule?" he asked. You studied him. "No." "Why not?" "Because I didn't need to." He frowned. "That's not an answer." You walked to the basin and poured him water. "You think ruling is power. It isn't, it's weight. And you don't lift it by being louder. You lift it by letting others forget it's on your shoulders." He drank slowly. "Then what is power?" You turned, knowing when to speak and when to be silent. He held your gaze. "You could have been queen." You shook your head. "I was never the queen. I was the mirror they didn't break." He reached for your hand. "And what do I become, then?" You answered without pause. "You become what they fear most." He returned to you often after that night. Never announced, never summoned. Sometimes he came in silence, just to sit by your brazier as the coals died to ash. Sometimes he asked questions about the old rituals, about the years before his birth, about what it meant to carry a name that wasn't chosen but inherited. You never called him my son. Not once, but he called you my mother only once and never again. Because after that word passed between you, something shifted. He no longer asked for truth. He began to recognize it without speaking. One evening, he brought you a gift, wrapped in papyrus and tied with a strip of leather. You unwrapped it slowly, a mirror, aged, polished, until it caught the firelight like a piece of sun itself. You turned it in your hands. "It belonged to her," he said. You didn't need to ask who. The queen had vanished days earlier. Rumors said she had left for pilgrimage. Others whispered exile. Some said she'd gone willingly. Others that she was removed. But you knew she had stepped aside. Not as punishment, but as prophecy. She had read the signs, and she had chosen silence. You held the mirror longer than necessary, feeling the weight of its frame in your palm. She watched herself in this every morning, he said. "Now, I want you to." You looked up. Why, he didn't smile. "Not fully, because now I see you without her reflection." You said nothing, but something inside you folded gently inward. Not in fear, in release. Your position shifted once. Again, you were no longer called advisor. You were no longer mirror. You were simply present. In every chamber of council, your chair was placed beside his. In ceremonies, you stood just behind his right shoulder. When foreign emissaries arrived, they bowed to him, but they looked to you for approval. You didn't speak often, but when you did, even the wind outside seemed to still. He began making changes, not loud ones, not immediate, but deliberate. He reduced the number of military tributes. He opened grain stores earlier during the famine season. He ordered the construction of a library in Thebes, not just for priests, but for all scribes, regardless of bloodline. The court whispered, "He has been bewitched. She is feeding him honey and poison in the same breath." She was always dangerous. Now she's divine. You heard it all, but you didn't answer, because the truth did not need to shout. The queen never returned, but her memory hung in the halls like incense. Sometimes, when you walked the western corridor at night, you felt her presence, not angry, not mournful, simply watching, approving, as if she had waited for this long before either of you were born. The high priest summoned you privately. You expected rebuke, but he only asked for your hand. He pressed your palm to a clay tablet and marked it with ink. "For the record," he said, "to seal your place." You nodded, not because you sought position, but because he needed you to accept it so the gods could. One night, your son asked you a question you didn't expect. "If I wed my sister," he said, "will it be enough?" You met his eyes. "For what?" "To preserve what we are." You walked with him then through the pillars of the upper court, where shadows danced between torchlight. "You were born of something old," you said, "but the world changes." He didn't answer, so you continued. "They married their sisters, not out of desire, but out of fear, of losing what was theirs, of letting the blood thin, of gods turning their backs." He nodded. "Would you fear that?" You asked. He looked toward the Nile. "I don't know," he said, "but I know I am not afraid of you." That was enough when the time came. The court prepared another ritual, this one greater than any before. He would be crowned not just as Pharaoh, but as something else. A new word was carved beside his name, Kitamiset, the one who unites what has been divided. You were asked to bless the ceremony, not as mother, not as consort, but as the keeper of lineage. They gave you robes of ivory, sandals sewn with onyx beads, a crown made of reeds and gold thread, the symbol of continuity. You stood beside him as he ascended the throne. You did not cry, you did not smile, you simply stood, and for the first time, the people chanted not just his name, but yours later. In the stillness after the procession, you removed the crown. As it helped you unwrap your robe, you sat together by the window, just as you had in the garden years before. "He will be remembered," she said. You looked out at the skyline, where temple fires burned low. "So will she," you replied. "Which one?" she asked. You looked at her. "All of us." The palace changed again, not with construction or color, but with feeling. Where once there had been posturing, there was now stillness. Where once power was spoken in riddles, it now moved in glances and gestures. And at the center of it all sat a ruler whose blood carried prophecy, and whose mother had never been crowned. You had become more than a symbol. You had become origin. Your son ruled with patience. He did not rush decrees. He did not chase monuments. He allowed advisors to speak, then allowed silence to fall. In that silence, they learned to listen not to the echo of their own voice, but to his. He came to you for counsel still, always after dusk, always when the court had quieted. One night, as the lamps burned low, he asked, "Did you ever love my father?" You turned your head slowly, considering. "I honored him. That's not what I asked." You folded your hands. "In your lap, no. I didn't love him." "Why?" "Because he didn't know me." He exhaled through his nose, thoughtful. "Will they say the same about me one day?" You met his gaze. "That depends on whether you see them before they are chosen for you." The scribes began to draft a new law, one that removed the requirement for divine siblingship in the next generation of royal unions. A bold change, a dangerous one. When the law passed, some temples fell into quiet discontent. One priest, older than most statues, refused to bless the edict. He claimed it would invite drought, rebellion, plague. He was not punished. He was reassigned to a temple far south, where prayers still echoed to empty rooms. Your son said nothing, but you watched him write the man's name on a stone and place it on the altar in the temple of Marat, a silent tribute. You realized then he had not erased the old ways. He had absorbed them and given them new shape. Your presence at court became ceremonial. Your words, rare. Your movements, deliberate. The young scribes called you the voice between thrones, a title not recorded on any stele, but spoken in hush, as if sacred. You began to sense a distance, even in respect. Not coldness, but reverence. So deep it bordered on loneliness. They bowed too deeply. They watched your face too closely. You had become a story they told while you were still living. Is it aged quickly that year her joints stiffened? Her breath shallowed in the colder months. You offered her warm compresses, salt baths, honeyed figs. She resisted fuss. Let the world forget me slowly, she said. I won't forget you, you replied. She smiled. I'm not worried about you. When her time came, it was under a fig tree in the lower courtyard. Her eyes open, watching the sky fade from pink to gold. You held her hand until it cooled. Then you kissed her brow and whispered the song your mother once sang to you. The reed bends, the river carries, the soul follows the sun. They buried her without announcement, because she had never needed recognition to be eternal. After Isit's passing, your nights became quieter. You walked the upper corridors again, the ones near the Queen's old wing. Dust gathered there, those servants swept it weekly. No one lived in those rooms now. You entered her chamber once. Unexpectedly, it had been left untouched. The incense bowls, the carved ivory comb, a single unfinished scroll beside the bed. You ran your fingers over the glyphs, the story of Hathor's daughters, goddesses, who bore silence like armor, who spoke only when rivers changed course and empires shifted. You closed the scroll and placed it in your robe. You read it often in the months that followed, not for its wisdom, but for its reminder that some stories begin long before anyone speaks them aloud. Your son took a bride, not his sister, not a cousin, a woman from the Delta, scholar-born. Her name was Tiah. She did not wear heavy robes or speak in riddles. She met your eyes directly. When introduced, she bowed not deeply, not fearfully, but evenly. You studied her posture, her steadiness. Later that evening, in the garden, your son asked, "Do you approve?" You answered without hesitation, "She does not fear silence." He nodded. "That's why I chose her." The wedding was modest, symbolic, no processions, no sacrifices, just lotus petals, gold rings, and a shared cup of wine that you stood at the edge of the ceremony, wrapped in linen dyed the color of the Nile at dusk. You did not cry, you did not smile, but when Tia looked at you and did not look away, you felt something settle inside you, a peace you had not expected to arrive that winter. The priests approached your son with a request to carve your image. Beside his, on the walls of the new temple, an act usually reserved for queens, goddesses, or ancestors long past. He agreed, but only under one condition, that no name would be inscribed beside your likeness. The priests were puzzled. He explained, "She is not one woman, she is the line itself." You watched as artists chiseled your form into the wall, your robe draped, your hand outstretched, your face calm, no crown, no jewelry, just a scarab resting at your throat. When they asked for your approval, you touched the stone and said, "She looks like she has already lived." They nodded. They did not know whether you meant past or future. It began to rain more often. Not heavy storms, not floods, just quiet rain, soft as breath against the stone. It pattered along the edges of temple roofs and pooled between the bricks of the garden walkways. It was not common in this part of the kingdom, but the priests called it a blessing. a sign that the gods were listening again. You called it memory, falling gently from the sky. The palace slowed. Your son ruled firmly now, not as a boy king, but as a man who had seen power up close and learned how to survive it. The old advisors came to him carefully, with fewer words and more bowed heads. He ruled beside his wife Tia, whose hands were never still, always sorting scrolls, grinding herbs, marking the margins of maps. She asked questions. She sat through long readings. She looked at the stars, not as signs of prophecy, but as parts of a pattern she might one day understand. You watched them quietly, from the edge of each room, from shaded balconies, from your seat behind the gold-veined column at the throne hall. You did not interrupt. You were not needed, and that was the deepest piece of all. Your name remained, unspoken in court documents. But when messengers crossed the river, when merchants told stories at the city's edge, when travelers asked who truly guided the heart of the kingdom, they did not say the pharaoh's mother. They said only the one who was sister. Vessel, mirror, Mother Anne still stands. You moved to the northern wing, a quieter space. The chamber overlooked a narrow garden where figs ripened early and the scent of mint lingered in the hot air. No guards were posted, no bells rang when you entered a hall, yet everyone moved aside when they saw you, not out of fear, but out of rhythm, like reeds shifting around the current of a river that has always been there. You wrote again, not in fragments this time, not on broken pottery, on scrolls, smooth and long, kept in a reed basket near your bed. You wrote what you remembered, not just events, but feelings. The texture of silence before a summons, the way sandalwood smells when it clings to your wrist, the sound of a child's breath in the first moments after birth. You wrote not for historians, but for her, whoever she would be, the one who might one day sit where you had sat, wonder what you had wondered, and search the stars for answers no priest would give her. Your son came to you one morning before sunrise. No attendants, no guards, just him in a pale linen robe, his hair unbound. You were watering the herbs by the window when he entered. Mother, he said. You hadn't heard him call you that in years. You turned, he knelt not in reverence, not in ritual, but in rest. I had a dream, he said. You waited. You were walking along the edge of a river, and each time your foot touched the water, it turned into stone. You smiled, and what did that mean? He looked up, that even rivers need a path to follow. You touched his shoulder. You are the river now. Tia visited you later that week. She brought pomegranate wine and honey cakes, though you could eat only a few bites. She sat across from you and folded her hands in her lap. Your words are being copied, she said. The scrolls, yes. The priests at Thebes requested them. You nodded slowly. They will twist them, she smiled. Gently, then we'll untwist them again. You studied her face, the calm beneath the fire, the steadiness that came from knowing she had chosen her place, not been born into it. You'll guide her well, you said. She blinked, double quotes who? The girl, you paused. The one you will carry soon. Her eyes widened. I don't know, I do. You stood. You moved slowly now, but not weakly. You took her hands and pressed them together. When she arrives, you said, tell her my story. But not all of it. Let her ask for the rest. You spent more time outside in those final days. The rain had stopped, replaced by warm winds and the call of cranes flying low along the river. Sometimes children played in the outer courtyards, chasing one another with ribbons tied to reeds. They didn't know who you were. They didn't bow. They only laughed, and that too was peace. You sat beneath the acacia tree near the temple wall and watched the sun sink each day. The sky turned to gold, then to blood, then to memory. When your time came, it was quiet. You were alone, but not lonely. No sickness, no sharpness, only stillness. Your breath slowed. Your thoughts became light. Not images, not stories, just impressions, water in motion, linen on skin. A child's hand gripping your finger. You did not fear. You had already lived 1,000 lives. You had been girl, vessel, consort, exile, mother, echo, witness. You had been the thread between generations. You had held silence like a sword. You had answered power with stillness. You had survived what was never meant to be survived. And now, you were becoming what no story could fully name. They found you the next morning, hands folded, face serene. No shrine was built, no statue raised, but at the edge of the garden, near the tree where you last watched the sun, a single stone was placed. No inscription, only the carving of a mirror, and behind it, 2 falcons facing each other.